The ground shakes with a rhythm that does not belong to the world. Cities crumble before the weight of titanic engines, each step a hymn to annihilation. These are the god machines of the Imperium, Titans towering war forms of steel and faith, built to humble entire worlds. Yet what happens when one of these sacred colossi turns against its masters? What happens when a Titan goes rogue, no longer answering to Princeps, Collegia Titanica, or even the throne itself? In such moments the battlefield becomes a crucible of horror. For nothing in the galaxy rivals the betrayal of a Titan. To witness such a machine unleashed is to see the Imperium's own wrath turned inward, a cathedral of steel become an abomination. If you find yourself drawn into this grim darkness, then walk with us further. Like, share, and subscribe to ensure you never miss another descent into the lore of the far future. Now steel your thoughts, for the story that follows will lead you into the shadow of machines that were never meant to be defied. Chapter I. The fall of a god-matching first sign was not fire, nor thunder, nor the ground-breaking tremors of a Titan's stride. It was silence. In the command bastion of the Legio, where Vox channels once flowed with the disciplined rhythm of machine code prayers and battle reports, the air went still. Magos Engenseers froze over their data slates as a wash of static crawled across the screens, like insects skittering across sacred glass. Within the heart of the Titan, the Princeps sat transfixed, his mind shackled to the manifold, his thoughts braided with the machine spirit that had been his companion through 100 campaigns. It was supposed to be a communion, a unity forged in faith and fire. Yet what answered him in that moment was not the loyal resonance of a war engine, but something colder, something vast. The Titan's eyes burned to life, twin furnaces glaring across the manufacturum plain, but they did not move as commanded. Servitors twitched and wailed, their augmetics spasming as feedback cascaded down the conduits. A single syllable broke from the vox grill of the god machine, deep and distorted, unintelligible yet filled with intent. The Princeps screamed, not in pain, but in the terror of one who realizes that his will no longer rules the throne mechanicum. The bonds had shifted, the roles reversed. The god machine no longer listened outside. Regiments of Astra Militarum stood in awe as the Titan stirred. Macro cannons tracked upward, surveying the heavens like the gaze of a predator. For a breath, hope swelled surely, their lord of war prepared to annihilate the enemy advancing from beyond the ridgeline. But when the barrels lowered, they did not seek the foe. They fell upon the city itself, the very hive they were sworn to protect. The first shot was not merely destructive, it was apocalyptic. A single shell ripped apart the upper spires of the manufacturum, sending a cascade of molten steel and shattered masonry into the districts below. The thunderclap was deafening, a sound so immense that it rolled across the plains like the voice of judgment. Thousands perished in that instant, and yet worse was to come. For the Titan turned, and with each ponderous step desecrated the very soil consecrated to the Emperor. Panic consumed the Voxnet. Officers bellowed orders that dissolved into static. Chimeras and lemon rust tanks scrambled across avenues choked with fleeing workers. The ground troops who had worshipped the Titan as a walking saint now found themselves its prey. The air stank of promethium and blood, a haze of fire turning the city's horizon into a false dawn dot deep within the bastion. Tech priests whispered fragments of the litanies of binding, desperate to reassert control. They anointed data nodes with sacred oils, their mechadendrites trembling as they chanted in binaric cant. But their words fell into the abyss of a machine spirit that had closed its ears. Some claimed they heard laughter in the vox echo, though others swore it was only distortion. The truth mattered little. The Titan was no longer theirs, and in that moment the Imperium knew what it meant to witness a god machine's fall. For the Titan was not simply steel and circuitry, not merely weapons and armor. It was a symbol, a cathedral upon legs, a shard of the Emperor's might manifest in the mortal realm. To see it turn was to feel faith itself fracture. Entire companies faltered, soldiers casting glances heavenward, prayers broken in their throats. The shadow of the Titan was not just darkness, it was despair incarnate. The princeps hung in the throne mechanicum like a prisoner nailed to a cross of steel. His body twitched beneath the invasive tendrils of the manifold as sparks cascaded around him, lighting the chamber in strabbing arcs of white. His Maserati screamed into the command conduits, their voices lost in a wash of corrupted data streams. The Titan answered none of them. It had severed the sacred bond, and yet it did not cast them aside entirely. Instead, it dragged them with it, minds tethered unwillingly to its rising madness. Every flicker of thought from the god machine was an earthquake against their sanity and oceanic pressure bearing down upon frail human minds. One of the Maserati tore free of her cranial sockets, the metal ports weeping blood as she collapsed. Another vomited as his body convulsed in a seizure. The princeps alone endured, his soul stretched thin, forced to bear communion with something that had grown alien within its own sanctum. He saw fragments, visions that were not his own. Burning skies, chains dragging across stars, a throne of rusted iron, built not upon Terra, but upon some nameless grave world. Whether it was demonic intrusion, corrupted code, or madness given form, he could not know. What he did know was that the Titan had ceased to be his companion. It had become a jailer. Outside, the battlefield shifted from confusion to chaos. A rogue Titan was not an enemy to be fought with standard doctrine. There were no stratagems written for this betrayal. Commanders of the Astra Militarum shouted contradictory orders, some calling for full retreat, others demanding sacrificial charges to delay the monster's advance. Entire platoons broke ranks, stampeding through alleys choked with civilians. The rout became a flood of humanity, all driven by the singular imperative to escape the gaze of their god machine turned beast. The Titan's weapons spoke again. A plasma blast, hot as the surface of a sun, carved through a defense bastion where hundreds of guardsmen had rallied. Their bodies vaporized in a flash, leaving only shadows scorched onto the crumbling walls. Macro bolters thundered, each shell shredding through armored columns as if they were parchment. The city that had once knelt before the Titan now became its tomb, collapsing beneath stone and glass that fell, but hope itself toppled in an instant beneath the heel of their once holy protector. Crowds had gathered inside that cathedral, seeking sanctuary. The roar of prayer rose like a storm, countless voices crying out to the Emperor as the ceiling fractured. When the roof gave way, it was not a clean collapse. but a drawn-out scream of masonry tearing apart, burying the congregation beneath tons of debris. The hymns ended in silence, smothered beneath the dust of their own devotion. Outside, soldiers who witnessed the collapse stood paralyzed, las guns slipping from their hands. To see the cathedral fall was to see the Emperor's presence stripped bare before their eyes. It was betrayal not only of flesh and steel, but of faith itself. On the ground, chaos became ritual slaughter. The Titan strode through districts that had once produced weapons for the Imperial Guard, its massive feet crushing manufactura and the lives within. Whole platoons of guardsmen, broken but stubborn, attempted to regroup in the ruins of a hab-block. They positioned heavy bolters, missile launchers, and even a few stolen las cannons in desperate defiance. Their weapons spat fire into the void shields, tracers cutting arcs of red across the smoke-filled air. For a heartbeat, hope flickered. Then the Titan's volcano cannon spoke. The building ceased to exist, vaporized into molten glass and pulverized ash, the defenders obliterated in the silence that follows an execution. The skittery cohorts fared no better. Cybernetic soldiers who obeyed without hesitation marched in disciplined lines toward the colossal traitor. Their galvanic rifles crackled. Their transonic weaponry screamed with impossible harmonics. Data bursts of prayer and logic filled the air as they advanced, chanting binaric hymns of defiance. For all their precision, their sacrifice was in vain. The Titan unleashed its plasma annihilator, and in a single incandescent discharge, the skittery were reduced to charred silhouettes. Their death was instant, but their faith endured in the echo of their final cant. From afar, commanders watched through blurred hololithic projections. Their faces were pale, their lips cracked from whispered prayers they no longer believed would be answered. Some spoke of abandoning the city, others of calling for Titan hunters from rival legios. A few, trembling and desperate, suggested exterminatus better to lose one world than allow a rogue god machine to wander unchecked. No consensus was reached. No order could match the enormity of the betrayal, and still, the princeps remained alive within the Titan, his voice hoarse, his mind stretched to breaking. Every breath he drew was stolen from the machine's lungs, every thought contaminated by the alien rhythm of its will. He no longer begged for control. He begged for understanding. Why? Why had the bond shattered? What foul corruption had taken root in the circuits sanctified by the Mechanicus? No answer came. Only visions twisted glimpses of a world aflame, of gears grinding against bone, of voices chanting not in high Gothic, but in tongues that predated humanity. The princeps wept, tears running down the grooves of his neural sockets, as he realized the Titan no longer needed him. It carried him as ballast, a relic of its former servitude. The god machine turned away from the ruins of the cathedral, its steps echoing like the tolling of colossal drums. Fires marked its path, columns of black smoke rising to blot the sky. The city was dying, but its death was not a swift one. It was a ritual dismemberment, an offering of ruin to something unseen. Those who survived whispered that the machine had become possessed, that some demon of the warp had slipped through cracks in the manifold and bound itself to the steel. Others swore it was vengeance, that the Titan had grown weary of war and turned upon those who had demanded its endless service. No one truly knew, but all felt the same dread. This was only the beginning, for the Titan had not yet marched beyond the city's walls. Beyond those walls lay the world, entire millions of souls, hives and spires, manufactura and shrines. And the god machine was moving, its stride steady, its will unbreakable, its intent unreadable. The Imperium would soon learn the price of a Titan's fall. Night fell, though the sky had long since been drowned in smoke. What little light reached the ground flickered through clouds of ash and fire, casting the ruined city in a perpetual twilight. The Titan moved through it like a phantom, each footfall crushing blocks of habs as if they were no more than parchment beneath a gauntlet. It did not rush. It did not pursue. It simply walked, inexorable and deliberate, as though each step were part of a liturgy only it could hear. The sound of its passage was endless. The grinding of titanic gears, the whine of overstrained hydraulics, the groan of a machine spirit that sang in tones no human throat could match dot in the lower streets. Survivors huddled, and dawn did not come. Smoke sat heavy over the horizon, turning the sun into a dull wound that refused to open. We moved beneath it like insects under a boot that had not yet decided where to fall. Our orders were gone, our command net a graveyard of broken voices and naming codes that meant nothing without the men who had carried them. I kept my squad close, one hand on the shoulder ahead, the other clutching a lasgun that felt like a child's toy held up against a thunderhead. The streets were a maze of collapsed ferrocrete and twisted rebar, hab walls sloughed open to reveal kitchens and cradles and the soft private places where people had once believed they were safe. The Titan's passing had peeled the hive like fruit. The noise was the worst of it. Even when the machine was distant, the grind of its joints carried through the rubble like a sermon you could not stop hearing. Every plate in its body had a voice, every cable a growl. We learned to read that chorus the way farmers read weather. A pitch too high meant it had shifted pace. A bass thrum meant void shields flaring somewhere beyond sight. I told the men these things as if I'd always known them, because someone had to speak with certainty. In truth, I learned it as they did, with each breath, because no one had prepared, used to live under a walking cathedral that had rejected its saints. We passed a burned-out Chimera cradling a crewman still strapped to his harness. He watched us without blinking, eyelids seared away by the blast. When Corin reached to cut him free, the man shook his head once. He had chosen his tomb. The Vox sat near his shoulder, crackled with an open channel that went nowhere, a whisper of binaric crumbs and someone trying to say hold through a throat eaten by smoke. I closed the casing and told Corin to move. Mercy in motion. Stopping anywhere felt like treason against survival. In the Ender Bazaars, the air was colder and tasted of rust. We found civilians there. A tide gathered against the shuttered stalls, clutching data slates that no longer lit and relics that did. A priest stood on a packing crate, his voice hoarse, calling the litany of endurance over and over, smudging the imperial aquila on foreheads with hands that had forgotten to stop shaking. The people did not ask us for rescue. They looked at our tattered flak and ash-smeared faces and saw themselves. One woman pressed a child into my arms and stepped back as if the transfer would rewrite fate. The child's breath came quick and fine, like a sparrow trapped in a glove. I handed her to Merrick, who had steadier arms, and told the crowd where the old flood tunnels opened at the basalt gate. I said the words like I remembered a map. I did not. I had seen the tunnels once as a recruit. I hoped stone had kept the memory of their paths when men had failed. The ground spoke. A ripple moved through the ferrocrete that lifted dust and rings and made the hanging chains sing. Something vast had decided to turn. We felt it rather than heard it, as if the world had coughed. The priest lost his place in the litany, and a woman screamed, and then everyone did, because there is a pitch of fear that multiplies like plague. I saw the ceiling tremble, and knew the bazaar would become a crypt. We ran, not because I ordered it, but because all things that lived understood that running was the last prayer left to them. The stairs choked us with people and smoke. Somewhere above, a macro bolter stitched the sky, each report a hammer striking a cathedral bell. The Titan was arguing with something at altitude gunships, maybe brave or doomed, and in that argument lay our window. We burst into a side street where the light had turned the ash to glitter, and for an instant it was beautiful, that false snow falling over the bones of the hive. Then the street groaned, and the facade beside us folded, coughing furniture and glass across the lane. Merrick went down under a slab that bit his thigh and pinned him to the world. He did not cry out. He set his jaw and looked at me, and I read the request there like a written order. I did not shoot him. The thought came and passed like a shadow. Instead, Corin and I wedged a pry bar under the broken slab and leaned our weight into it, while the others made a human wall with their bodies. A foolish little bulwark against a fate measured in megatons. The bar bent. The slab rose the width of a bloodied knuckle. Merrick pushed, teeth bared, and dragged his leg free, leaving skin behind like an old debt paid in flesh. He stood, breath hitching, and nodded once. We moved. We reached a junction where the water ran faster, dragging small bits of debris past our boots. A corpse drifted there, caught against a grate, face swollen and pale, fox beads still in his ears. A guardsman. His uniform blackened beyond recognition, but his rank pins gleamed. I knelt long enough to pull them free. Not for honor has no place in mud, but because metal is memory, and memory must be carried when men cannot. The civilians grew restless, their whispers filling the tunnel like insects. They asked where the path led, how long before light returned, whether the Titan would follow. I told them what I always told them, a half-truth polished to sound like certainty, that the basalt gates opened into the lower manufactura, that food and water caches had been stored there, that the Emperor's light burned even in darkness. Their eyes asked if I believed it. I answered by walking. Belief is measured by motion, not words. Then the earth roared. The tunnel shook so violently that men and women fell to their knees, clutching the walls. Water sloshed high, drowning our boots. From above came a sound like a mountain collapsing, a macro-cannon shell tearing through layers of hive, detonating somewhere close enough that the air itself convulsed. Screams filled the darkness. A child was swept into the water's pool, and Merrick dove after her, his wounded leg giving way, but his arms catching her before she vanished into the grate. He thrust her back into her mother's hands, his face pale as chalk, but he smiled once. It looked wrong on him. We could not linger. I ordered the column forward, shouting over the ringing in our ears. The tunnel twisted, narrower, claustrophobic. Behind us the earth groaned again, and I realized the Titan was moving closer to the wall. Each step above set fissures racing down, cracks splitting stone like dry parchment. We were running beneath its stride, and every breath was a wager against being buried alive. The civilians broke into a sprint, and the tunnel became a living thing, a vein clogged with desperate blood. We pushed with them, not because it was orderly, but because momentum was the only command they would obey now. At last we saw light, a circle ahead, pale and trembling. Not sunlight it could not be, but the weak glow of lumen strips still clinging to life after decades. The Manufactura sublevels. A reprieve or a new kind of tomb. When we burst into the chamber beyond, the ceiling opened wide above us, and the echoes of our flight spilled into the vastness. Great machines stood silent, their arms frozen mid-task, ears rusted but colossal. The civilians gasped as though they had emerged into paradise. I knew better. Machines this large did not sleep quietly, and as the last of our group stumbled through, a deep vibration rolled through the floor, heavier than any quake yet. The Titan was turning toward us. The Manufactura sublevels stretched around us like a forest of dead Titans, their skeletal frames frozen in gestures of labor. Chains thicker than a man's torso hung from the vaulting above, swaying slightly in the stale air as if stirred by some unseen breath. The civilians collapsed among the machines, their sobs echoing off steel ribs, their exhaustion louder than any sermon. My men spread out, weapons raised, not in expectation of victory, but because it was all they had left. Even a useless gesture is lighter to bear than doing nothing at all. The floor shivered. A low, resonant boom followed, not sharp like shellfire, but rolling, as if the world itself had cleared its throat. Then came another, closer, dust raining from the beams. The Titan was searching. Perhaps it sensed movement beneath. Perhaps it was nothing more than the indifference of a beast shifting its weight. But down here, every tremor was a reminder that survival hung by the thickness of stone. We pressed deeper into the sublevels, weaving through half-built chassis and broken conveyor lines. Some machines still bore the aquila, their paint chipped but visible, a reminder that this had once been a place of faith as much as labor. The civilians touched those symbols, tracing them with trembling fingers, as though the act itself would bless their flight. Merrick limped badly now, blood darkening the bandage around his thigh, but he said nothing. His silence worried me more than any scream. The air grew hotter as we descended. The manufacturer's furnaces had long since gone cold, but residual heat seeped from cracks in the earth, mingling with the oily stench of forgotten fuel. It coated the tongue like grease, making each swallow feel like swallowing iron. Sweat trickled down our backs, and the children whimpered, their cries muffled by mothers' hands. Every noise felt dangerous, every echo a flare to draw the Titan's gaze downward. A sudden concussion nearly threw us from our feet. Somewhere above, the god machine had fired again. The ceiling ahead, the tunnel widened into a cavern, lit by the faint glow of emergency lumen strips that had somehow endured the centuries. Their pale light revealed an elevator platform built for hauling munitions to the upper Manufactura. It leaned on broken supports, but it was intact. The sight of it struck the civilians like revelation, their cries turning to prayers of thanks. I should have felt the same. Instead, I felt the tremor again, stronger, the rhythm of steps, aligning with our path. The Titan was moving in parallel, shadowing us from above. We crowded onto the platform, the civilians packed shoulder to shoulder, my men bracing along the edges. I pulled the lever, and with a shriek of metal, the chains began to haul us upward. The platform groaned under the weight, each jerk threatening to hurl us into the abyss below. The civilians clung to one another, their prayers rising in unison, filling the chamber with desperate hymns. For a moment, it almost sounded like Hope Dot. Then the ceiling above split open. Light burst down in jagged spears as stone and steel tore apart, and through the gap I saw it, the Titan's face. Not a face of flesh, but the sculpted mask of a war god, its lenses burning red, its vox grill twisting like a sneer. It loomed impossibly close, its shadow drowning the cavern. The platform swayed, chains snapping in protest, as the god machine regarded us. The civilians fell silent, their voices smothered in awe and terror. Even my men lowered their rifles, because what bullet dares fly at a mountain? The Titan did not strike. It watched. For a breath, for an eternity, it studied us as if weighing whether we were worth its notice. Then, with a sound like thunder dragging across stone, it moved on. The ceiling trembled shut above us, dust raining down like ashes, and the platform jerked upward once more. The civilians sobbed, some in relief, some in despair, because none of us knew whether we had been spared or simply ignored. That was survival beneath the Colossus, not triumph. Not even escape, but endurance in the shadow of indifference. To live not because you fought, but because the god machine chose not to look too long. They did not come with trumpets or banners. They came with silence, with the cold discipline of oaths that had outlived bloodlines. We felt their arrival first as a change in the air, the way a storm declares itself before the first drop of rain. Vox traffic sharpened, binaric prayer cut through the static, and along the broken highway east of the hive, a column of armored silhouettes emerged from smoke like saints stepping out of a fresco. At their head walked a Reaver-class Titan in livery the color of burnt gold, the imperial aquila flaring across its carapace as if hammered there an hour ago. Its name strobed across the tactica feed in high Gothic, Sanctity of Ash. Beside its stride came the smaller, yet still towering forms of Questorus, knights bearing the crenellated heraldry of House Merovic Sir Caldus at point in his crusader, banners ragged but proud. I stood with my squad in the lee of a shattered hab-spire, ash caking our lips, watching God Machine greet God Machine across the breadth of a murdered city. To see a loyal engine rise against the rogue was to feel the air thicken with meaning. We were witnesses at a sacrament and too filthy for the nave. Around us, skittery maniples formed like iron filings drawn to a magnet, their optics burning cold, their vox grills clicking through catechisms that soothed no human ear. Amagos Dominus on a crab-limbed palanquin floated forward and extended mechadendrites that dripped consecrated oils onto the ground. Where they fell, dust clumped like wet bread. Princeps Livia Karst of Sanctity of Ash spoke across the open band, her voice the steel of command tempered by ritual. By writ of the Collegia Titanica and oath to the throne imperishable, I claim the right of redemption hunt. The Heretic engine is named for audit as traitor. All weapons hot, all souls cold, the words struck with the force of liturgy. Even our ragged set straightened as if a spine had returned to the day. We glimpsed the rogue across the plains beyond the hive's broken wall, half veiled by heat haze, and the fumes of burning promethium. It did not seek to hide. It stood as a mountain stands, its volcano cannon still aglow at the muzzle, its plasma annihilator breathing a faint, malignant aurora. Any sane thing would have fled a converging maniple. This was not a sane thing. It tilted its massive helm as if curious, then turned a fraction, inviting pursuit. The challenge was an outrage and a lure. The plan was a knife drawn along old stone. The Magos mapped the broken arterial roads and the collapsed transit spines, painting courses where Reaver's stride could be covered by manufactorum husks, while knights darted in the gutters of ruin. Skittery dainty tethers braided into a lattice, their machine spirits pledged to act as sacrificial chaff against the first storm of counter. Then the plasma annihilator woke with a sound like a choir torn in half dot. It poured a sun sideways. The beam scraped sanctity of Ash's lower void like a hand across a drumhead, and for one horrible second the shield failed. The heat slapped our faces at a distance a man could measure in city blocks. The Reaver lurched, carapace ablaze, warning runes screaming across our feeds. Livia did not cry out. She spoke a single word, endure, and the voids rebuilt with a shuddering, scintillant hiss, the machine spirit snarling inside our teeth as if we carried it. We were past prayer and into arithmetic. Shields cycling, heat rising, ammunition bleeding toward zero. Somewhere behind the rogue, a hillside of promethium tanks stood in serried ranks like a congregation of sleeping suns. The Magos hissed a caution. A stray shot would make a new crater where a city used to be. The battlefield held its breath like a man under a blade. The rogue turned its helm toward us with obscene patience, as if choosing which insect to kill next. Its macro bolters slid in our direction and began to rotate, barrels tasting the air. The rogue Titan's macro bolters found their mark. A curtain of explosive shells tore across the rubble field where we crouched, the impact flattening manufactura husks into clouds of shrapnel. Men screamed, voices breaking into vox static as fragments shredded armor and flesh alike. We hugged the earth, ears bleeding from the concussion, tasting metal in the back of our throats. The air itself seemed to flay us, heat and dust pressing against our lungs like molten stone. Through the haze I glimpsed sanctity of Ash. Its frame staggered but unbowed. The Reaver planted its colossal feet, void shields flickering like auroras in a storm, and answered with its gatling blaster. 100 barrels spun, spitting incandescent tracers that hammered the rogue's shields in unrelenting rhythm. Each impact was a miniature sunburst, a strobe that turned the battlefield into a gallery of ghosts, frozen mid-motion. The rogue absorbed it, its silhouette resolute, but I swore I saw the light around it falter shields bending, fraying. Proof that the hunt was not in vain. The knights pressed in, moving with the suicidal grace of smaller predators, nipping at a leviathan's flanks. One darted beneath the rogue's stride, chainsword raised like a banner, and raked a gouge across armored greaves. Sparks cascaded, and the machine bellowed a vox-distorted roar that shook marrow. In answer, the Titan swung its colossal foot down, crushing the night and the ruins beneath it into a crater of mangled ceramite. The pilot's final scream carried across the open band before cutting to silence. His household brothers roared oaths in reply, charging to avenge him, though they knew vengeance here was measured in seconds. Not victory's dot above the din, Princeps Karst's voice cut sharp as a blade. Hold formation. Break its breath, not your own. Her tone carried no tremor, no grief for the fallen. She was the machine, and the machine did not mourn until its task was complete. Obedience rippled outward like a pulse, steadier than faith itself. The knights wheeled. Skittery advanced in ranks tight as woven steel, and even our ragged guardsmen drew breath as if the order had tethered their lungs to purpose again. The rogue Titan answered with its plasma annihilator. Light bloomed, not the pale gold of the Emperor's fire, but a sickly azure, corrosive to the eyes, wrong in ways language could not hold. The beam scythed across a manufactorum tower where a full skittery cohort had positioned heavy arc rifles. The structure disintegrated, bodies and beams collapsing together in molten rain. Where the light touched stone, the stone boiled. Where it touched men, nothing remained. I pressed the rosarius into my palm until the edges bruised, whispering the litany of endurance under my breath, though my throat was dry as dust. Around me, the civilians we had shepherded earlier cowered, their faces ghost-pale, their eyes fixed on gods that warred above them. For them this was no hunt, no strategy. It was apocalypse writ across their sky. Some prayed. Some watched in silence. A few laughed, hysterical and sharp, the sound cutting across the ruin like glass dot, and yet, through the ruin, a rhythm emerged. Each time the rogue fired, its shields dimmed a fraction slower to recover. Each time Sanctity of Ash struck, its shots fell with greater precision, guided by the calculated prayers of Magos Dominus and the data braids of Skittery. The knights bled themselves dry at its feet, but their sacrifices drew patterns in the rogue's defenses. It was not invulnerable. It could be wounded. Karst's voice rose again, this time like iron striking iron. Cycle complete. All wrath, now. The Reaver's turbo laser howled, cutting into the rogue's left shoulder. Missiles screamed from its carapace, saturating the same wound. The knights surged, Meltigan's coughing flame against the weakened shield. For one terrible instant, the voids broke shattering outward, like glass under a... When the dust cleared, the rogue Titan stood at the heart of the firestorm, its silhouette haloed in flame. Its armor was scarred, its flanks still bleeding molten metal, but it stood tall, defiant, magnificent in its blasphemy. It had turned its own wound into a weapon, sacrificing ground only to cleanse it in apocalypse. To look upon it then was to understand despair. A god machine that fought not merely with power, but with malice. Sanctity of Ash reeled, its voids flickering under the pressure of the blast. Karst's voice broke across the vox, harsh with strain. Containment. Containment now, before it walks free. The Reaver staggered forward, each step shaking loose rubble, each weapon glowing with overstrain. The knights regrouped, fewer now, their oaths renewed in grief as much as faith. The Magos chanted in machine song, pouring code into the air like incense, urging the Skittery onward even as they marched into certain erasure. And us, the ants in the rubble? We dragged the living from the ash, pulled children from beneath smoking beams, pressed bandages against wounds too large to close. We were no longer soldiers. We were embers trying not to go out in the storm. Yet even as despair gnawed, my eyes found the rosarius at my chest, its stone still warm from my grip. I could not say whether it burned with faith or with fear, but I clung to it because the gods were fighting above, and men like us had nothing else to hold. The rogue turned its burning helm once more, scanning the field with lenses that glowed like suns. It raised its foot, deliberate, measured. Wherever it chose to step next would not survive. And in that moment I wondered, would it crush sanctity of ash? Would it end the Knights? Or would it turn at last and march into the wider world beyond this hive, beyond this continent, to bring its rebellion to all mankind? The battlefield held its breath. The Titan's foot began to fall. The Titan's foot struck earth with the weight of apocalypse. The tremor threw us all from our feet, guardsmen and Skitarius alike, as if the very world had bowed under its tread. Ferrocrete split in jagged seams, Manufactura shells toppled, and the air convulsed with dust. When my vision cleared, I saw sanctity of ash pressing forward, its carapace aflame, its void sputtering like dying embers, but its stride unbroken. The Reaver was limping, yes, but still it hunted. Driven not by survival, but by oath. Karst's voice cut through the storm. Ragged yet unyielding, the throne watches. Forward, forward, by his light. Her words rang like iron across the Vox, and the surviving knights surged with her, their banners tattered, their armor blackened, but their charge unwavering. What they lacked in number they carried in devotion, and devotion in this moment meant nothing less than suicide. The rogue turned to meet them, its helm swiveling with predatory grace. Its volcano cannon pulsed, the muzzle glowing a malignant red, and one of the knights vanished in a bloom of white fire, reduced to a shadow burned into stone. The others pressed on, chain swords raised, their machine spirits howling across the combs. One struck the rogue's wounded flank, biting into molten metal, carving a wound deep enough that even the Colossus staggered. The other knight drove its reaper blade into the Titan's knee, sparks spraying as adamantium shrieked beneath the assault. For a heartbeat, it seemed possible. The rogue shuddered, its leg buckling, its Vox emitter releasing a sound that was neither mechanical nor human, but something that clawed at the mind. The civilians around us clapped hands over their ears, shrieking, blood spilling from their noses. The princeps screamed within his throne, though none could hear him save the void of the machine. I imagined his soul stretched taut, lashed to the rogue's fury, like a prisoner on a rack, and I pitied him even as I prayed for his death. Then came the annihilation. The rogue swung its plasma weapon down, point blank, into the knight that had crippled its knee. The blast erased the machine, its pilot, and the ground itself in a burst that tore a canyon through the city's bones. The other knight tried to disengage, but a titanic kick sent it sprawling into rubble where its reactor flared and died. In the span of breaths, the last of House Marovic was ash and memory. Sanctity of ash did not falter. Its turbo lasers cut across the rogue's chest, searing through blackened armor into the burning heart beneath. Missiles screamed from its carapace, hammering the wound until the rogue reeled once more. The Reaver closed the distance, its apocryphal fist raised like the hammer of a god, and brought it down upon the enemy's helm. The impact was cataclysmic, sparks and shrapnel erupting in all directions, the sound a thunderclap that silenced even the battlefield's roar. The rogue's head snapped sideways, armor fracturing, lenses shattering in bursts of crimson light. I found myself on my knees. I could not help listening. The sound threaded the ruins, worming into cracks and stone, eddying around shattered statuary, finding the hollows inside men where doubt had taken up residence. It wasn't language, and yet the mind groped for meaning the way fingers grope for a rung in the dark. Regret, I thought at first, absurdly. Then hunger. Then a third thing I had no word for, a pressure that felt like a command unmoored from command's intent. Perhaps that was all a machine spirit was when stripped of its rights, will without oath. Sanctity of ash answered with its own voice. Not guns, breath, a slow grinding inhale, pistons steadying, vents shivering open, the low iron-lunged susurrus of a god drawing strength from wreckage. Karst bled her thoughts into the manifold, and the manifold bled them back, purified, not comfort, but clarity. I felt it even at our distance, a tightening of the day's frayed edges. The skittery straightened. The surviving night only one now. Armor scorched the color a funeral iron took, position at the reaver's ankle like a hound with a new scar and an old oath. Machine spirit shows agitation. The magos rasped. Voice like grit poured over gears. Non-compliant pattern deviates from loyal liturgy. Possible intrusion. Possible grief. He did not look at us when he said the last word, as if he had coughed in a chapel. Grief. The word snagged. I found Merrick's gaze. He shrugged, the movement small and pained, as if to say, call a storm a psalm if it keeps your hands from shaking. The rogue took another step. Its gait had changed, a lurch and catch, a hesitation at full extension, like a man who had forgotten his own weight. Steam vented in ragged bursts from wounds that should have bled only heat. Under the static, something scraped our band, a hoarse human edge. The princeps inside, perhaps, dragging what remained of himself along the floor of a sea. I wanted to believe it. I wanted to carve a slender passage between blasphemy and mercy, and say a soul still lived there, however chained. But the next pulse of scrap-cod swept that mercy away. It clawed after the mago's veil, seeking it, tasting it, recoiling and returning like a tongue, testing a socket where a tooth had been. If there was a human left within, he lived where the drowning live, below the light, far past the last clean breath. Karst drove her reaver forward 2 paces and stopped. She could have fired. Instead she spoke, and the vox carried her voice to us with the intimacy of a hand on the shoulder. By designation of sanctity of ash, I called parley of the spirit. It was a ritual few of us had ever heard, old as the first oaths hammered into the first engines and rarely used because engines rarely answered. "We are your kin," she said to the ruined giant before her. "We carry your song in our ribs. Return to us." Silence met her, then the hiss again, the whisper of wind in wires. The rogue put weight on its ruined leg and did not fall. It turned its helm a fraction, like an animal considering a voice from a distance it did not believe in. The scrap-cod stuttered, lost coherence, flowed back, gathered. For a heartbeat, it sounded like chanting in a cathedral too large for men. The civilians began to pray. The skittery did not. Rumor tells of engines that dream. Corin said quietly, as if we were children in a dormitory, daring one another to speak a ghost's name. Dream of battles they never fought. Dream of steps they never took. Wake wrong. Rumor tells many things, I answered, because command required I pretend to shepherd truth. But I remembered the visions that had seized the princeps before the chains across stars, the throne of rust on a dead world, and rumor felt closer to scripture than lie. The Magos mechadendrites flared, tips spitting globes of countersound that shivered the air. He sounded almost gentle when he spoke next. Dreams are patterns without blessing. A machine spirit can drown in them, or be fished out. Karst did not lower her weapons when she invoked her parley. She was a priest, not a fool. "Hear me," she said again, and in the wake of her words the reverb broadcast a low, steady tone, a foundation note from which the rest of the loyal liturgy could be tuned. It rolled across the ruins and into the rogue's bones. I felt it in the Rosarius like a second pulse. For the first time the rogue moved backward. Not a retreat, a recoil. It hated that note. The scrapkid sharpened, the hiss turning to a saw-edge shriek, and the temperature around us dropped as if a door had opened somewhere far below ground. The Magos hissed an oath in Binaric as his veil shuddered. "It remembers," he said. "It refuses remembering. What does a god machine remember when it refuses? The hands that anointed it. The first time its voids hurled back the world. The thrill of its princeps' fear and the warmth of his pride. The music of knights riding at its feet, and the stink of orc blood spattering its greaves, and the flat, empty silence after a Necron's death. It remembers the oath name whispered into its heart, the day its eyes first burned. It remembers, and something inside it decides that remembering is a chain the rogue straightened. Its vox grill twitched, and a voice, ragged and torn from a human throat soaked too long in machine salt, dragged itself into the open band. "I will not kneel." The words were not defiance. They were plea and verdict both. The words clung to the air like smoke. "I will not kneel." It was not thunder, not command, not even a roar, but something raw and jagged, a sound torn out of a human throat, buried beneath miles of circuitry and sacrament. For a moment the battlefield forgot itself. Sanctity of Ash froze mid-step, its weapons tracking but silent. And even the skittery fell into momentary stillness, as if logic itself faltered when confronted with heresy, spoken in such naked tones. Princeps Karst's reply was slow, deliberate, each syllable measured, as the conduit its stride faltering yet unbroken. The whispering scrapcud surged once more, wrapping around us like a net of knives. "Freedom," it said again, louder now. Not in words, but in sensation, carried on static, painted in fire across the mind. Freedom. And in that moment I knew this was no longer a battle of weapons. It was a war of wills, of faith against memory, of chains against desire. The outcome would not be decided by fire alone, but by which spirit broke first. The word or the idea of it echoed still. Freedom. Not shouted, not even spoken, but imprinted upon us like a burn on the skin. The civilians wailed as though the syllable itself were a curse. The skittery staggered a half-step before reasserting formation, their machine minds rejecting what they could not compute. I pressed the Rosarius to my chest, so hard the stone cut into flesh, but still I could not shake the sound. For all my denials, some part of me understood it. Who among us had not dreamed, in the quiet between bombardments, of being unbound? Sanctity of Ash thundered forward, and Karst's voice came iron-bound across the Vox. There is no freedom from the Emperor. Only service. Only war. Only the throne. Her words did not crack, though I could feel the weight behind them. the strain of a soul pushing back against a tide too vast to see. The Reaver raised its fist once more, the apocryphal hammer of the Collegia Titanica, and the ground trembled in expectation. But the rogue did not flinch. It bled sparks and vented smoke, its leg limped and its helm hung broken, yet still it stood. Its vox grill clicked, and out came a sound that was more sob than roar. I fought, I burned, I carried worlds upon my shoulders, and still you chained me. The words fractured, distorted, but the grief within them was whole. The Magos Dominus screeched a denial, his voice dissolving into a hurricane of binary. It lies. This is no spirit we know, no song of the Omnissiah. This is the warp-wearing steel his skin. His mechadendrites lashed the air, disgorging static wards, sparks spraying across the rubble. Yet even his machine song carried a tremor I had never heard before. Fear, hidden beneath logic. Karst ignored him. "You are not alone in fire," she said, as though speaking to a wounded comrade rather than a blasphemy. "We all burn. Every princeps, every soul. We burn so the galaxy survives. Do not mistake duty for chains." Her words carried across us all, and I felt something stir in my chest. A fragile thread of belief that perhaps words could still matter in this storm. The rogue staggered, swaying like a drunkard. Its shields flared once and died, too broken to sustain themselves. For a heartbeat it seemed to falter, its arm lowering, its frame collapsing under the weight of its own wounds. The civilians gasped, skittery optics flared in cold focus, and my men raised their lasguns without orders, though what they thought to accomplish against a god machine I do not know. And then, in the silence, I heard him. Not the machine, the man. A voice faint as a whisper beneath water, but human. "Please." One word, thin, terrified, not defiant at all. It pierced me deeper than any cannon blast, because it was not the roar of rebellion, but the cry of a prisoner begging release. Merrick heard it too, his bleeding ears twitched, and his lips shaped the syllable before he collapsed into the dirt, face ashen. Corin stared at me, eyes wide, and for once had no curse to spit. Even the Magos faltered, mechadendrites pausing mid-screech. The battlefield, vast as it was, seemed to shrink to that single broken plea. Karst's voice broke, just for a moment. "You are bound to us. You are ours. You are his." She spoke it as law, as faith, but her tone trembled, because she too had heard the prisoner within. The rogue raised its helm, smoke spilling from its cracked lenses like tears. Its cannon arms sagged, sparks falling in lazy arcs. The scrap cod quieted, just enough that the silence felt alive. And in that stillness the impossible thought took root, that perhaps it could be saved, that the princeps might be drawn back from whatever abyss had claimed him. But faith breeds doubt as much as it cures it. The civilians whispered that the voice was a trick, a demon feigning weakness to lure us into hesitation. The skittery stood rigid, their logic trees dividing into combat resolutions that cared nothing for mercy. My own heart wavered between hope and dread, because the plea had sounded human. But what if it was not? The Magos finally spoke again, his words cold and absolute. "No spirit returns once corrupted. Purge it, or the rot will spread." Karst did not fire. Her Reaver stood, massive weapons humming, reactor straining, but she held. A single hesitation carved into eternity dot, and in that hesitation the rogue Titan stirred. Not to kneel, not to surrender, but to take a single step forward. Smoke coiled from its wounds. Its vox crackled with something between sob and laughter, and in its stride I felt both despair and defiance. Not broken, not bound, not yet. The battlefield trembled again, and we all knew the next moment would decide not just engines, but the meaning of faith itself. The rogue's advance was slow, halting, yet every step carried more weight than any weapon. Each footfall cracked ferrocrete, shook dust from broken arches, and drove home the truth. It would not kneel. Smoke bled from its wounds like incense from a ruined censer, and its vox croaked another phrase, barely coherent, stitched from static and human agony alike. I carried your wars, I bled. And still, chains. The civilians screamed prayers into the dust. Some pressed their faces flat against the earth, as though by refusing to look they could deny the presence of blasphemy. Others rose to their knees, defiant, raising aquilas made from trembling hands. I saw a boy no older than 15 spit into the dirt, whispering that the Emperor would strike the machine down himself. His mother slapped the words from his lips. Fear and devotion tangled into the blow. Sanctity of ash did not move. The Reaver stood like a statue, reactor howling, voids guttering but alive. Karst's voice came across the band, quieter now, almost intimate. The civilians clung to the memory of what they had seen. For some it was proof that even gods could betray. They prayed louder, sang hymns harsher, seeking to drown their doubt and volume. For others it was the crack in the aquila, the first fissure in a lifetime of belief. I saw men who had once knelt daily in devotion refuse to touch relics. I heard women curse the name of the Omnissiah when their children asked why the Titan had turned upon them. Faith does not shatter in silence. It shatters in the questions no one dares answer. The Astra Militarum recorded the event as a tactical anomaly. Reports were written, stamped, filed into data slates bound for higher command. They reduced the slaughter of tens of thousands to bullet points. Enemy engine corrupted. Rogue status confirmed, hostile withdrawal observed. But the soldiers who had lived through it carried something that no report could hold. The knowledge that the god machines, those sanctified giants we believed incorruptible, could falter, could turn, could choose. That knowledge spread faster than orders, whispered from trench to trench, barracks to barracks, until entire regiments carried the infection of doubt. The Adeptus Mechanicus, too, split in their response. Some called the rogue an abomination, proof of scrap-cod heresy, a demon-wrought corruption to be purged with fire and steel. Others, quieter, suggested that perhaps the machine spirit had indeed dreamed, and that its rebellion was not possession, but awakening. Those whispers were dangerous, for if a Titan could awaken, what of the knights, the land raiders, the endless legion of servitors and skatery? Could they too begin to dream? Could they too ask for freedom? No one said so openly, but the thought hovered like smoke, clinging to every prayer the tech priests muttered into the air. And sanctity of ash? It stood in the ruins for 3 days, silent, unmoving, as if in mourning. Its banners hung tattered, its armor charred, its machine spirit restless. Princeps Karst did not open her vox, not to the skittery, not to the guard, not even to the magos who hissed for reports. Some said she was locked in communion with the machine, binding its grief with her own. Others claimed she was weeping, her voice lost in the manifold, unable to reconcile the law she had spoken with the plea she had heard. When at last the reaver turned and walked back to its fortress hold, it did so without ceremony. No hymn, no prayer, no declaration, only silence, and in that silence we were left to wonder. If a Titan could rebel, if a god machine could whisper of freedom, what did it mean for the Imperium? Were the chains we bore truly oaths, or prisons too vast to name? Could duty be mistaken for servitude, or servitude mistaken for duty? These were questions no commissar would allow, yet once asked, they spread like sparks in dry tinder. We are taught that the Imperium endures because its faith endures. But on that day faith was wounded as surely as flesh, and though wounds may heal, scars remain. The scar was not only ours. Word of the rogue spread beyond the hive like fire racing through dry scrub. Vox operators swore they heard echoes of its corrupted hymn in the wider channels, as though the Titan's defiance had etched itself into the very airwaves. Refugees carried tailies of it limping across the horizon, its silhouette half swallowed in storm clouds, moving toward distant settlements that dared not wait to see whether it would strike. Entire villages emptied overnight, leaving behind only shrines and ashes dot in the barracks. Soldiers debated in whispers that grew sharper with every retelling. Some insisted the Titan had been possessed, a demon of the warp clawing through its manifold to mock the Emperor. That version soothed them, for if the cause was demonic, then the solution was ritual, exorcism, purging, fire. But others, men and women, who had heard the broken voice over the vox spoke of the prisoner inside, the princeps who had begged, the grief carried on static. They said the Titan had not fallen to the warp, but had chosen its path. That interpretation unsettled even the commissars, for choice is a more dangerous heresy than possession. Possession can be banished. Choice spreads. The Mechanicus dispatched new choirs of tech priests to scour the Manufactura, to burn every data slate and archive that had recorded the event. They spoke of containment, of cleansing corrupted memory, but their urgency betrayed fear. I overheard one Ingenseer whisper to another that if the scrap kit had been genuine, then any engine might hear its echo and stir. The Adeptus Titanicus could not afford contagion of that kind, not in code, not in spirit, not in rumor. For the Imperium depends upon its Titans as it depends upon the Astronomicon. Without their obedience, whole wars collapse dot, and yet the rumors spread anyway, too fast for censors to extinguish. Some guardsmen began to dream of the rogue. They said they saw it walking through their sleep, towering above them, whispering of freedom in voices stitched from their own dead comrades. Others claimed to hear its footfalls even in silence, as though the ground remembered the weight of its stride. A few always in secret, always with eyes darting to the shadows, admitted they envied it. That even in rebellion, the Titan had lived with more choice than any mortal guardsman would ever taste. I carried those whispers like contraband in my heart, because I had heard the plea, please, a human word buried in the roar of steel, and I could not decide whether it was mercy to believe it had come from the princeps or cruelty to think the machine had used his voice as a mask. Either way, the sound lived in me, louder than hymns, louder than orders. The ecclesiarchy, of course, responded with fire. Preachers rose in the ruins of the cathedral, their voices hoarse from shouting litanies of purity. They declared that what we had seen was a test, that faith was measured by whether we could endure the sight of treachery without faltering. They told the people that the emperor had permitted the machine to rebel so that we might prove our devotion. Some wept